The most dangerous secret in the room wasn't hidden in a bank account. It was hidden inside a name. At precisely 7 p.m., the chandeliers inside Sterling House cast warm reflections across polished marble floors as Manhattan's wealthiest families gathered for another sold-out charity gala. Crystal glasses chimed softly. Expensive watches caught the light with every handshake. Conversations drifted between billion-dollar mergers, private schools, and summer homes along the coast of Maine. Everything appeared flawless. Everything was carefully rehearsed. Everyone knew one unspoken rule. If Victoria Sterling walked into the restaurant, you smiled, stayed quiet, and prayed she wasn't seated in your section. New employees usually learned that rule within their first week. Veterans had learned it years ago. It wasn't because she shouted. It wasn't because she threatened anyone. Somehow, her calm disappointment carried more weight than raised voices ever could. One cold glance from the billionaire's daughter had ended careers, reduced seasoned managers to nervous apologies, and left confident waitresses questioning themselves before they even reached the table. Tonight, the whispers began long before the black SUV stopped outside. "She's here." The words traveled across the dining room like a sudden gust of winter air. A young waitress nearly dropped a serving tray before catching it just in time. Another quietly asked the floor manager if tables could be reassigned. Even the executive chef stepped out of the kitchen to make certain every plate leaving the pass looked perfect. Then the doors opened. Victoria Sterling entered with effortless elegance, dressed in an ivory evening suit that matched the confidence in every measured step she took. Her blonde hair rested neatly over one shoulder. A diamond bracelet shimmered beneath the lights. Behind her walked Richard Sterling, founder of Sterling Holdings, one of America's most respected billionaires. His silver hair, tailored navy suit, and calm expression reflected decades of discipline and success. Guests stood instinctively as they passed. Some nodded respectfully. Others simply watched. The father acknowledged. Then with a quiet smile. The daughter barely looked around the room. Claire Bennett stood beside the service station, smoothing the sleeve of her black uniform. At 27, she looked no different from the other servers. White apron, comfortable shoes, blonde hair secured into a simple bun, calm blue eyes that rarely lingered on anyone for long. She had worked at Sterling House for only 11 days, long enough to memorize the menu, long enough to earn compliments from regular guests, not long enough to understand why every employee suddenly looked terrified. "Claire," whispered another waitress, her voice barely audible. "Trade sections with me, please." Claire blinked. "Why?" The woman swallowed. "Table 12. Claire glanced toward the elegant corner table where Victoria Sterling was removing her gloves. "What's wrong with table 12? The waitress stared at her in disbelief. "You really don't know." Before Claire could answer, the floor manager approached with forced composure. "Claire, you're serving Mr. Sterling and Miss Sterling tonight." For the first time all evening, every conversation around the service station stopped. Several employees lowered their eyes. One quietly mouthed, "Good luck." Claire simply nodded, picked up 2 menus, and walked toward the table with steady steps that neither rushed nor hesitated. Richard Sterling looked up first and offered a polite smile. "Good evening." "Good evening, sir." Claire returned the greeting warmly before turning toward Victoria. The younger woman was adjusting the clasp on her diamond bracelet without looking at the menu. Claire's eyes drifted there for only a heartbeat. The bracelet, a tiny silver engraving hidden beneath the clasp, almost invisible, almost impossible to notice unless the light struck from exactly the right angle. Claire stopped speaking. Her breathing slowed. Something in her memory stirred with startling clarity. A name. Not Victoria. Another name entirely. She looked at the bracelet once more, then into Victoria's eyes. Her voice remained gentle, almost apologetic, but every word landed with impossible precision. "I'm sorry, Miss Sterling, but has anyone called you Eleanor?" "In a very long time." The sound of silverware touching porcelain echoed through the silent dining room as Victoria's hand froze above the table. Victoria Sterling did not answer. Her fingers remained suspended above the white linen tablecloth, motionless except for the faintest tremor that only someone standing as close as Claire Bennett could have noticed. The conversations throughout the restaurant dissolved into uneasy silence. Even the soft melody from the grand piano suddenly felt distant. Richard Sterling slowly turned toward his daughter, his expression shifting from polite curiosity to quiet confusion. Eleanor, he repeated gently, as though testing a word that belonged to someone else's memory. Claire immediately lowered her eyes with professional composure. I apologize if I have made a mistake, sir. Her voice remained calm, respectful, and completely free of accusation. She simply placed the menus on the table with steady hands before taking a small step backward. Victoria recovered first. Years of public appearances had taught her how to rebuild a composed expression in seconds. A restrained smile appeared across her face, elegant enough that most people in the room would have believed nothing unusual had happened. You are mistaken, she said evenly. My name has always been Victoria. Claire nodded once. Of course, Miss Sterling. Nothing more. No argument. No explanation. She accepted the response exactly as it had been given. Yet something invisible had already changed inside the room. Richard looked carefully at his daughter for several long seconds before offering Claire a courteous smile. Thank you. We will need another minute before ordering. Certainly, sir. Claire turned and walked back toward the service station with the same quiet confidence she had shown since the beginning of her shift. The moment she disappeared into the kitchen entrance, whispered conversations erupted across the dining room. Nobody understood what they had just witnessed, but everyone had seen Victoria Sterling hesitate. That alone was enough to leave the staff unsettled. Emily, another waitress, hurried toward Claire the instant she reached the coffee station. What were you thinking? She whispered, barely able to hide the panic in her voice. Do you have any idea who she is? Claire calmly filled a water pitcher before answering. I know exactly who everyone believes she is. Emily stared at her without understanding. No, seriously. Managers have been fired because she complained about cold soup. One server quit after she corrected the way he folded a napkin. You cannot just call her by another name. Claire placed the pitcher onto the silver tray with careful precision. I did not call her by another name. I asked a question. Emily shook her head. That is even worse. Across the room, Richard Sterling quietly watched Claire as she moved between tables. She never rushed. She never appeared intimidated. She treated every guest with the same gentle professionalism, whether they wore designer suits or ordinary jackets. There was something strangely familiar about her composure. Not her face, not her voice, the way she observed before she spoke, the way she seemed to notice details other people overlooked. Richard had built an international business by trusting those instincts in himself. Seeing them in an unfamiliar waitress unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Meanwhile, Victoria reached for her glass of sparkling water but stopped again when the diamond bracelet reflected the chandelier above. Almost instinctively, her thumb slid beneath the clasp, covering the tiny engraving hidden on the inside. A movement so quick that almost nobody noticed. Almost nobody except Claire. From the opposite side of the dining room, Claire lifted another tray while quietly watching the reflection in the polished wine cabinet rather than staring directly toward the table. Years ago, someone had taught her that people revealed far more when they believed no one was looking. She remembered the engraving exactly as she had seen it. The letters had not been random. They had formed a name that had disappeared from public records more than 20 years earlier. It was not a common name. It was not one anyone could guess. And yet there it was, carefully hidden beneath a bracelet worth more than most families earned in several years. Claire took a slow breath before walking toward another table carrying fresh bread and warm smiles for guests who had no idea that a single forgotten name had quietly cracked the perfect image of one of America's most admired families. The dinner service continued as though nothing unusual had happened, yet an invisible tension lingered beneath every polished smile and every carefully folded napkin. Claire Bennett carried plates through the dining room with the same steady rhythm she had maintained since her first shift, but she could feel curious eyes following her from nearly every corner of the restaurant. The newer employees watched her with disbelief. The veterans watched her with concern. None of them understood how a waitress who had worked there for less than 2 weeks had managed to say the one word that seemed capable of unsettling the untouchable Victoria Sterling. Richard Sterling remained unusually quiet. Normally, charity dinners were effortless for him. He greeted donors by name, remembered birthdays, congratulated scholarship recipients, and made every guest feel important. Decades of leadership had made kindness his greatest strength. Tonight, however, his attention drifted repeatedly toward his daughter. Victoria appeared composed once again, discussing foundation projects with a local hospital director and thanking supporters with practiced grace. But Richard noticed the smallest changes because he had spent 31 years watching her grow. She touched the bracelet far more often than usual. She smiled a fraction of a second too late. Every now and then her eyes searched the room, always stopping where Claire happened to be serving another table. Richard quietly folded his napkin. "Victoria," he said in a calm voice, "have we ever known anyone named Eleanor?" She looked at him with perfect control. "No, father." "You answered very quickly." "Because the answer is simple." Richard nodded, although something inside him remained unsettled. His instincts had protected his company through recessions, hostile acquisitions, and impossible negotiations. Those same instincts rarely whispered without reason. Across the dining room, Claire stopped beside an elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. She congratulated them warmly, recommended a dessert they had never tried before, and listened patiently as they shared a story about meeting at a county fair many decades earlier. She smiled naturally, completely present in their moment of happiness. There was no sign of anxiety, no hint that she had just become the center of the most uncomfortable conversation in the restaurant. Emily watched from the service station with growing confusion. "Who are you?" she murmured under her breath. Claire returned the empty plates and simply asked, "Can you bring fresh coffee to table 5 while I refill the water pitchers?" Emily blinked. "That is all you have to say?" Claire offered a small smile. People deserve good service regardless of what is happening around them. Those words stayed with Emily longer than she expected. Meanwhile, Richard excused himself from the table and walked toward the gallery overlooking the dining room. From there he could see nearly every guest. He also noticed something he had overlooked before. Claire never stared directly at people when she observed them. Instead, she noticed reflections in polished windows, silver serving trays, and crystal displays. She watched without making others feel watched. It reminded him of someone he had met years earlier, a retired investigator who once told him that the truth often revealed itself when people believed nobody was paying attention. Richard quietly approached the floor manager. "How long has Miss Bennett worked here?" 11 days, sir." "Any previous experience?" "Only that she came with excellent references from a small historical archive outside Boston before changing careers. Beyond that, very little." Richard looked surprised. "A historical archive?" "Yes, sir. She never talks much about herself." Richard thanked him and returned toward his table, carrying a question that refused to leave his mind. Why would someone trained to preserve forgotten records choose to spend her evenings serving dinner? At the same moment, Claire entered the wine cellar to retrieve another bottle requested by a guest. She paused for only an instant before reaching into the pocket of her apron. Inside rested a neatly folded piece of paper, worn softly along its edges from years of careful handling. She unfolded it just enough to reveal a single handwritten line before slipping it safely away again. It was the same name she had spoken only minutes earlier. Eleanor. She closed her eyes briefly, drew one quiet breath, picked up the requested bottle, and returned to the dining room wearing the same calm expression, while somewhere beyond the crystal chandeliers the past continued moving patiently toward the family that had spent decades believing it had been left behind. The evening settled into an elegant rhythm once again, but beneath the polished surface the atmosphere had changed in ways that could not be repaired by fine dining or carefully rehearsed smiles. Claire Bennett continued moving from table to table with quiet efficiency, refilling glasses before guests realized they were empty, replacing silverware without interrupting conversations, and offering every customer the same warm courtesy that had quickly earned the admiration of regular patrons. She neither avoided the sterling table nor paid it unusual attention. That decision alone fascinated Richard Sterling. Most people either tried too hard to impress his family or became visibly nervous in their presence. Claire did neither. She simply treated them like every other guest in the restaurant. Victoria noticed it as well. She had spent most of her adult life surrounded by people who reacted to her last name before they reacted to her character. Executives measured every word. Reporters searched for headlines. Hotel managers upgraded her suite before she even arrived. Restaurant employees memorized her favorite sparkling water and dessert without being asked. Claire had done none of those things. Instead, she had calmly spoken a name that should have meant nothing to anyone outside a very small circle, then returned to serving dinner as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. The thought refused to leave Victoria's mind. As the main course arrived, Richard thanked Claire for the meal with his usual kindness. "Everything looks wonderful." "Thank you, sir. Our chef will be happy to hear that." Richard hesitated before asking quietly, "Miss Bennet, have we met before tonight?" Claire met his eyes with the same calm expression she always carried. "No, sir. I do not believe we have. You seem remarkably certain about many things." A gentle smile crossed her face. "Only about the things I have personally seen." Richard considered the answer. It revealed almost nothing while somehow saying much more. Before he could continue, Victoria spoke for the first time since the opening moments of dinner. "Father, may we enjoy our meal without interviewing the staff?" Her voice remained perfectly controlled, yet Richard noticed the unusual sharpness beneath it. "Of course," he replied softly. Claire inclined her head respectfully and stepped away. As she disappeared toward another table, Victoria watched her reflection in the crystal centerpiece instead of turning directly. It was an old habit she had developed years ago whenever she wanted to observe someone without being noticed herself. To her surprise, Claire never once looked back. She simply continued helping an elderly veteran adjust his chair before laughing gently with a young family celebrating their son's acceptance into college. Every interaction felt genuine. Every smile reached her eyes. There was no performance, no hidden attempt to attract attention. Victoria found that strangely unsettling. Someone carrying a secret usually wanted recognition. Claire seemed to want the opposite. In the kitchen, the evening manager approached Claire while checking reservation notes. "Miss Bennet." "Yes." "The Sterling family specifically requested that you remain assigned to their table for the rest of the evening." Emily nearly dropped the stack of dessert plates she was carrying. "They requested her?" she whispered after the manager walked away. "That has never happened." Claire simply accepted the updated seating chart without visible surprise. "Then I will continue serving them." Emily lowered her voice. "You really are not afraid of them, are you?" Claire paused before answering. "Fear often grows in places where people stop asking honest questions." Emily frowned. "What does that even mean?" Claire looked toward the dining room, where laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Sometimes everyone becomes so busy protecting a story that nobody notices whether the story is true anymore. At nearly the same moment, Richard excused himself to answer a brief telephone call in the lobby, leaving Victoria alone at the table. She reached once again for the bracelet around her wrist. This time her fingers rested against the hidden engraving much longer than before. Memories she had spent years keeping neatly organized behind careful routines began surfacing one by one. A childhood photograph that no longer appeared in family albums. An elderly woman who had once whispered, "Never forget where you came from," before suddenly disappearing from her life. A birthday card signed with only the letter E, small fragments she had dismissed for decades because asking questions had always seemed unnecessary. Until tonight, Claire returned carrying dessert menus and gently placed one before Victoria. Neither woman spoke immediately. The silence between them felt remarkably peaceful despite everything that had happened. Finally, Victoria looked up. "Miss Bennet," she said quietly. "If someone spent an entire lifetime believing one version of their past, why would another person choose to disturb it?" Claire answered without hesitation, her voice soft enough that only Victoria could hear. "Because sometimes the truth is not trying to destroy a family. Sometimes it is trying to bring the real one back together." Victoria did not answer immediately. Instead, she lowered her eyes toward the untouched dessert menu resting beside her plate, as though the simple printed words somehow required all of her attention. Claire Bennet remained standing with quiet patience, never rushing the silence, never trying to fill it. Years of working around forgotten records had taught her that people often revealed more during silence than they ever did through conversation. Richard Sterling returned to the table just in time to notice the unusual stillness between the two women. He looked from his daughter to Claire, sensing that another conversation had taken place without him. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently. Victoria lifted her chin and offered the familiar composed smile that newspapers had photographed hundreds of times. "Everything is perfectly fine, Father." Richard accepted the answer, but not the certainty behind it. He had learned long ago that perfectly rehearsed words often concealed imperfect truths. Claire quietly placed a fresh cup of coffee beside him before excusing herself to attend another table. As she walked away, Richard noticed that Victoria continued watching her until she disappeared behind a marble column. That alone was extraordinary. His daughter rarely paid attention to strangers after a conversation ended. Tonight, she could not seem to let this one go. Across the dining room, Claire carried another tray toward a group celebrating a business anniversary. She listened politely as they joked with one another, recommended a local apple tart prepared from an old family recipe, and congratulated the company's founder on reaching 30 years in business. Her kindness remained effortless because it was never calculated. Yet even while serving other guests, a small part of her mind continued assembling fragments that had lived separately for decades. A hidden engraving, an unfamiliar hesitation, an old handwritten note folded safely inside her apron pocket. None of them proved anything by themselves. Together, however, they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. Emily approached while polishing wine glasses. "I have never seen Miss Sterling look uncertain before tonight." Claire smiled faintly. Sometimes certainty disappears the moment someone remembers a question they stopped asking years ago. Emily frowned. "Do you already know the answers?" Claire shook her head. "No. I only know where the missing pieces may be." At the Sterling table, Richard quietly stirred his coffee before speaking again. "Victoria, forgive me if I seem persistent, but that name clearly surprised you." She kept her eyes on the candle burning softly between them. "It surprised me because it was unexpected. Nothing more." "Then why have you touched your bracelet?" "At least a dozen times since she said it." Victoria's hand instinctively withdrew from the bracelet, as though she had been caught doing something she had not realized anyone could see. She laughed softly, attempting to dismiss the moment. "You notice everything." Richard smiled with gentle affection. "Occupational habit." The answer brought only a brief silence before another memory quietly surfaced inside Victoria's mind. She could not explain why, but she suddenly remembered opening an old cedar box as a little girl while exploring the attic of their summer home. Inside had rested several faded photographs tied together with a pale blue ribbon. Before she could look closely, a housekeeper had gently taken the box away and told her those pictures belonged to another family. At the time, she had accepted the explanation without question. Children often did. Tonight, for the first time in decades, she wondered why she had never seen that box again. The question settled heavily in her thoughts. Meanwhile, Claire entered the staff hallway to collect fresh linen napkins. As she opened the storage cabinet, the elderly restaurant owner, Margaret Lawson, happened to walk in carrying inventory notes. Margaret had spent nearly 40 years watching people come and go through Sterling House. She studied Claire thoughtfully before speaking. "Miss Bennet, you have the eyes of someone searching for something." Claire folded several napkins with careful precision. "Perhaps I am." Margaret smiled kindly. "Be certain you are searching for the truth and not simply a mystery. They are not always the same thing." Claire looked at the older woman with genuine respect. "That is exactly why I have waited this long before saying anything." Margaret nodded slowly, sensing there was far more beneath those words than Claire intended to reveal. As Claire returned to the dining room, carrying fresh linen, she noticed Victoria standing alone beside one of the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Their eyes met only briefly across the room. This time, however, there was no fear, no arrogance, and no challenge in Victoria's expression. There was only one quiet emotion Claire had expected would eventually appear: doubt. And sometimes, Claire knew, doubt was the first honest step any person ever took toward discovering who they truly were. The final course had been cleared away, but very few people seemed interested in leaving. Conversations continued beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, accompanied by the quiet sound of coffee cups meeting polished saucers. Outside, the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the evening sky, while inside Sterling House an entirely different kind of reflection had begun to form. Richard Sterling no longer saw the evening as another successful charity event. He saw unanswered questions. He saw his daughter's unusual silence. Most of all, he saw a waitress who behaved as though she had walked into the restaurant carrying knowledge instead of ambition. That difference intrigued him more than any business proposal he had reviewed in years. Claire Bennet continued clearing tables with the same measured pace she had shown since the beginning of her shift. She thanked departing guests, wished elderly couples a safe drive home, congratulated scholarship recipients, and smiled warmly at children who waved goodbye as their families exited through the grand entrance. Watching her from a distance, Richard found it almost impossible to reconcile the gentle young woman serving coffee with the person who had quietly unsettled the strongest certainty inside his own family. There had been no accusation in her voice, no demand for attention, only one carefully spoken question. Somehow that made it impossible to dismiss. Victoria remained beside the tall windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her coffee cup with one fingertip. For the first time in many years, she realized how little she actually knew about the earliest chapters of her own childhood. She remembered expensive schools, elegant vacations, holiday galas, and countless newspaper photographs beside her father. Everything before the age of 6, however, existed only as scattered images without clear beginnings. She had never questioned the gaps because love had never been missing from her life. Richard had raised her with unwavering kindness. That had always been enough. Until tonight. Richard quietly joined her. "You seem far away." Victoria smiled faintly. "Perhaps I am." He looked through the window before speaking again. "Do you remember your mother mentioning anyone named Eleanor?" Victoria slowly shook her head. "No, but I remember something else." Richard turned toward her. "What is it?" She hesitated. "When I was little, there was an older woman who visited once every year around my birthday. She always brought white lilies." Richard frowned thoughtfully. "I do not remember anyone like that." "Neither do I. Not clearly. I only remember her voice." She closed her eyes for a moment. She always said the same sentence before leaving. Richard waited patiently. She said, "Names carry people home." The words settled between them with unexpected weight. Richard searched his memory, but found only silence. Across the dining room, Margaret Lawson approached Claire while helping fold the final linen cloths for the evening. "The Sterling family is asking for their check." Claire nodded. "I will take it." Margaret studied her carefully. "You knew this evening would unfold differently, did not you?" Claire considered the question before answering. "I knew the past eventually finds every family. I simply did not know tonight would be the night." Margaret rested one gentle hand on the edge of the counter. "Whatever you are carrying, I hope it comes from compassion." Claire met the older woman's eyes. "If I wanted revenge, I would have spoken years ago." Margaret smiled softly. "Then perhaps you are carrying exactly what they need." Claire picked up the leather check presenter and walked toward the Sterling table. Richard accepted it with his usual gratitude before unexpectedly saying, "Miss Bennett, would you sit with us for 1 minute after your shift ends?" Nearby employees exchanged astonished glances. No member of the Sterling family had ever invited a server to sit at their table. Claire remained composed. "If my manager approves, I would be honored." Richard nodded. "Please ask him." Victoria looked at Claire for several long seconds before quietly adding, "There is something I need to know." Claire's expression remained calm, yet her eyes softened with genuine understanding. "I believe there is something you deserve to know." Neither woman said another word. They did not need to. Both understood that the evening had reached a point where silence could no longer protect the past. Somewhere inside Claire's apron, the carefully folded piece of paper rested against her heart, waiting for the moment when a forgotten name would no longer be a secret hidden beneath a diamond bracelet, but the beginning of a truth that had been patient enough to wait decades for someone willing to speak it aloud. The last guest slowly drifted toward the entrance, their conversations fading into the cool Manhattan evening, leaving Sterling House wrapped in a quieter kind of elegance. The staff moved with practiced efficiency, clearing crystal glasses, extinguishing candles, and preparing the dining room for another day. Yet no one hurried Claire Bennett toward the employee entrance. Everyone seemed to understand that the evening was not truly over. Richard Sterling remained seated at the corner table overlooking the city lights, while Victoria stood beside him with her hands folded quietly before her. Neither of them spoke until Claire approached after receiving permission from the restaurant manager. She removed her apron neatly, folded it across one arm, and took the empty chair Richard had offered. For several seconds, none of the three said a word. The silence felt respectful rather than uncomfortable. Finally, Richard spoke. "Miss Bennett, you said you believe my daughter deserved to know something. I have spent my life making decisions based on facts. I would simply ask that whatever you tell us tonight comes from truth." Claire nodded. "It does, sir." She reached into the pocket of her uniform and carefully unfolded the piece of paper she had carried throughout the evening. Time had softened its edges, and the ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting remained perfectly clear. She placed it gently on the table without sliding it toward either of them. "This is not an accusation," she said softly. "It is only the first piece of a story." Victoria looked down at the page. Written across the top was a single line in graceful cursive. "To my sweet Eleanor, may you always remember your first name, even if the world asks you to answer to another." Victoria felt her heartbeat quicken. The handwriting stirred something she could not explain. It was familiar in the way childhood lullabies remained familiar even after decades of silence. Richard leaned closer. "Where did you find this?" Claire answered honestly. "I did not find it. It was entrusted to the historical archive where I worked before becoming a waitress. Several years ago, a collection of private family documents arrived from the estate of a retired attorney. Most of the papers were ordinary legal records scheduled for preservation. This note was tucked inside a sealed folder that had never been cataloged." Richard frowned. "Why would our family records be in a public archive?" Claire shook her head gently. "They were not identified as sterling records. The family name had been removed from every document." Victoria slowly looked up. "Then how did you connect it to me?" Claire met her eyes with quiet compassion. "Because hidden inside the same folder was a photograph." She paused before continuing. "A little girl no older than 5 years old stood beside a woman holding a bouquet of white lilies. The back of the photograph contained only 3 words. Victoria barely whispered. "What words?" Claire answered with equal softness. "For Eleanor always." Neither Richard nor Victoria spoke. The room seemed impossibly still. Even the distant sounds of traffic outside had faded beneath the weight of those simple words. Richard finally broke the silence. "There must be thousands of little girls named Eleanor." "There are," Claire replied. "But very few wore a custom bracelet engraved with the same name beneath the clasp." Instinctively, Victoria removed the bracelet from her wrist for the first time that evening. She turned it over with trembling fingers. Slowly, almost fearfully, she examined the tiny engraving she had never truly read. Years earlier, she had assumed it was the jeweler's signature. Tonight she traced each delicate letter one by one. Eleanor. The name had always been there, hidden in plain sight. She closed her eyes as another forgotten memory quietly surfaced. She was very young, sitting on someone's lap while small fingers fastened the bracelet around her wrist. A gentle voice had whispered, "If you are ever lost, your name will help you find your way home." Victoria opened her eyes again, moisture gathering without a single tear falling. "I remember that sentence," she whispered. Richard looked at his daughter with quiet concern before turning back toward Claire. "You have shown us one page and one memory," he said carefully. "Do you believe there is more?" Claire folded her hands calmly upon the table. "Yes, sir. I believe this story was never erased. It was only filed under the wrong name." Richard Sterling leaned back slowly, his hands resting quietly on the polished oak table while his eyes remained fixed on the single sheet of paper before him. Throughout decades of board meetings and international negotiations, he had learned to separate emotion from evidence. Tonight, however, the evidence refused to remain separate from emotion. Every answer Claire Bennett offered seemed to create 2 new questions, and every question reached further back into a past he had believed was complete. Victoria still held the bracelet in her hands. Without realizing it, she gently rubbed the engraved letters with her thumb, as though the simple act of touching the name might unlock memories that had remained asleep for years. Claire waited patiently. She never interrupted their silence because she understood that some truths needed room to breathe before they could be accepted. Richard finally spoke. "If the family name was removed from those records, someone intended for them to disappear." Claire nodded. "That was my conclusion as well." "Then why were they preserved instead of destroyed?" Claire folded her hands together. "Because the attorney who handled the documents left one instruction before his retirement. He wrote that the sealed folder should never be discarded, even if nobody understood its importance. He believed someone would eventually come looking for the truth." Victoria looked up. "Did anyone ever come?" "No. Until you." Claire answered softly. "I was not looking for your family. I was organizing forgotten collections. Most days were ordinary. Then I opened one box that had been sitting untouched for decades." Richard listened without interrupting. Claire continued. "The folder contained only a few items. The handwritten note, the photograph, several pages listing legal transfers between private trusts. Nothing directly explained what had happened. But one detail appeared repeatedly. Richard leaned forward. What detail? A single instruction that every future record should identify the child only by her new legal name. The previous name was never to appear again. Victoria lowered her gaze, as though it had never existed. Yes, Claire replied. Exactly. The words settled heavily across the table. Richard closed his eyes briefly as fragments from long ago began fitting together in ways he had never considered before. His late wife had always handled certain legal matters herself during Victoria's earliest childhood. He had trusted her completely and never questioned the paperwork placed before him. There had never seemed to be any reason. He quietly opened his eyes again. You believe I did not know? Claire answered without hesitation. I do. Victoria looked from Claire to her father. Do you? Richard met his daughter's eyes with complete honesty. I cannot remember ever hearing the name Eleanor. If someone intentionally concealed it, they concealed it from me as well. The tension in Victoria's shoulders softened ever so slightly. She had feared that every answer might take her further away from the only father she had ever known. Instead, she suddenly realized he might have been searching for the same missing pieces without even knowing they were gone. Claire reached into her small shoulder bag and removed one final item. It was not a legal document or another photograph. It was a tiny pressed white lily preserved carefully between two sheets of archival paper. Time had faded its color, but its shape remained almost perfect. Victoria inhaled sharply. White lilies. Claire nodded. This flower was folded inside the photograph. Archivists preserve objects exactly as they are found. We do not separate stories from the things that carry them. Richard stared at the delicate flower. My wife disliked lilies. She always chose roses for every family celebration. Victoria whispered almost to herself. Then who kept bringing lilies on my birthday? No one answered immediately because none of them yet knew. Yet for the first time that evening, the mystery no longer felt like a threat. It felt like an invitation. Claire carefully returned the preserved flower to its protective sleeve before standing from the table. I have shared everything that belongs to me, she said quietly. The rest belongs to your family's history. Whether you choose to continue searching is entirely your decision. Richard rose with her. Miss Bennet. She turned politely. Thank you for protecting these fragments until the people who needed them were finally ready to receive them. Claire offered a gentle smile. Sometimes the hardest part of preserving history is not saving the documents. It is waiting until the hearts reading them are ready to understand what they mean. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of Sterling House, replacing the glittering reflections of the previous evening with a softer, more honest light. The restaurant had returned to its familiar rhythm. Coffee brewed behind the counter. Fresh flowers were arranged beside the entrance. Waitresses prepared tables with the same quiet care they showed every day. Yet for Claire Bennet, the world felt exactly as it had before. She tied on her apron, greeted her co-workers with a warm smile, and began setting polished glasses on neatly folded linen. She had not come searching for recognition, and she expected none. Emily walked beside her carrying a basket of fresh bread. I thought everything would be different today, she admitted. Claire smiled gently. Sometimes the biggest changes happen where nobody else can see them. At that very moment, a black sedan stopped outside the restaurant. Richard Sterling stepped out first, dressed simply in a charcoal suit without the usual entourage that often surrounded him. Victoria followed a moment later. She wore no designer jewelry except for the bracelet that now rested openly on her wrist, its tiny engraving no longer hidden beneath her sleeve. Every employee noticed them entering, but the atmosphere felt completely different from the evening before. There was no nervous panic, no hurried whispers. Richard approached Claire with the same quiet dignity that had always defined him. Good morning, Miss Bennet. Good morning, Mr. Sterling. Victoria looked at Claire for a long moment before speaking. I could not stop thinking about what you said. Claire listened without interrupting. This morning I visited my father's private archives before sunrise, Victoria continued. For the first time in my life, I asked to see every document from my earliest childhood. Richard nodded slowly. There were sealed boxes I had never opened myself. He paused before smiling softly. Some questions deserve patience before they deserve answers. Victoria carefully reached into her handbag and removed a small framed photograph. The picture had been cleaned overnight by a conservator from the family's foundation. A little girl smiled while holding white lilies beside an elderly woman whose gentle eyes seemed filled with quiet affection. On the back, written in fading ink, were the same words Claire had described. For Eleanor always. Victoria held the photograph against her heart. I still do not know every part of my story, she admitted. But I know now that my story began long before I learned the name Victoria. Claire looked at the photograph without triumph. Only gratitude. Every family deserves the chance to know where its first chapter began. Richard reached into his coat pocket and placed a small envelope on the table. Claire looked at it, but made no move to pick it up. This is not money, Richard explained with a smile. I suspected you would refuse that. Claire laughed softly. You know me better already. It is an invitation. Sterling Holdings is funding a national preservation initiative for forgotten community archives. We would like you to lead the historical advisory board if you ever decide to return to the profession you clearly love. Claire opened the envelope. There was no extravagant contract, only a handwritten note. History survives because ordinary people choose not to let extraordinary stories disappear. Thank you for reminding us that our own story deserved the same care. Claire quietly folded the letter and looked up. I would be honored. Victoria stepped forward. There is one more thing. She extended her hand with a peaceful smile. Whether my first name was Eleanor or Victoria, thank you for seeing me as a person before you saw me as a billionaire's daughter. Claire accepted the handshake warmly. Names matter, but character matters even more. Richard looked around the restaurant where employees had quietly paused to witness the exchange. Yesterday, everyone feared this table, he said with a gentle smile. Today, I hope they simply see three people sharing breakfast. Laughter spread softly across the room, dissolving the last traces of tension that had lingered since the gala. Claire returned to arranging silverware, while Richard and Victoria took their seats like any other guests. Outside, Manhattan hurried through another ordinary morning, unaware that inside one quiet restaurant, a forgotten name had not divided a family. It had given them permission to begin knowing one another more honestly than ever before. And as Claire welcomed the next customer with the same calm smile she offered everyone, she quietly remembered the lesson preserved inside every forgotten archive. The truth rarely arrives to shame the past. More often, it arrives with enough patience to help people carry it home.